Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome a new contributor to this episode. Her name is Hannah Schmid. She's a contributor for Young Voices, also a policy analyst for the Illinois Policy Institute. Hannah, welcome to the program. I'd love it if you'd take just a second and just kind of give us a little bit of your background, tell us who you are and what you do.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. Like mentioned, I'm a policy analyst at the Illinois Policy Institute. I mostly research educational freedom here in our great state of Illinois, and the intersection, which often happens with teachers' unions, intersection between labor and education. So we're really just fighting for a freer Illinois and parents to have more options to find the best academic outcomes and opportunities for their students.
I'm looking at an article you wrote for realcleareducation.com, and it's clear that Illinois, among other states, is facing some problems with students struggling to meet the proficiency standards. And you mentioned a couple of other states that likewise have encountered this, and they took very different directions. So basically, Illinois is facing a choice. Kind of set the situation for us. When we're talking about reading proficiency standards, where do those standards stand as it is right now for Illinois students?
So, unfortunately, right now we're seeing across our entire nation an early literacy epidemic, and Illinois students are suffering the consequences along with students in most every other state. Illinois is one of 41 states in DC, in which just 1 in 3 or fewer of fourth grade students met reading standards, so reading proficiency standards in 2024 on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So, like you mentioned, this is an issue facing not just Illinoisans, but students across our nation. This is especially concerning, just to set the scene of why we should care. Obviously, that sounds like a bad statistic, but beyond that point, the transition from third to fourth grade is a very critical reading milestone for students, and research has found students who struggle to read at grade level at this critical milestone, up to half of the printed curriculum in fourth grade forward is nearly incomprehensible to these kids, and they become 4 times more likely to drop out of school. So this is a very critical time. We want to catch students and ensure that they're at grade level standards in this really core subject of reading. So like you mentioned, there have been states that have taken different approaches to this. We see states like Mississippi, which have invested in science of reading, evidence-based reforms to ensure students are back on track in these early years. But we also see states such as neighboring Wisconsin from Illinois, which has lowered standards in their state assessments to in a sense, just inflate the number of students that we're seeing publicly meeting these standards, but it's not really changing that on these national assessments.
So which way is Illinois leaning as far as addressing this crisis? Have they given an indicator of how they'd like to approach it?
Education leaders in Illinois have unfortunately fallen prey to what looks nice and fancy up in Wisconsin, just, artificially raising these proficiency rates by lowering state standards. So again, like we said, in Wisconsin, we saw that they lowered their bar for proficiency and saw a 12% drop in the number of students who are scoring at their lowest level of proficiency. But again, that was just artificially inflated. And Wisconsin is not alone in this. At least 4 other states have also lowered their proficiency bars for students and seen scores artificially increase as a result of that. So Illinois leaders have toyed with this and are talking about this in a report they released on their vision for our state. I'm trying to push Illinois to lower our state benchmarks. But again, it's unfortunate when Illinois, we saw in the most recent national exam that just a third of students are even meeting grade level standards. So dropping those standards is not going to improve these rates, but what can is proven reforms like what we saw in Mississippi, where lawmakers, again, back in 2013, invested in evidence-based reforms, which saw Mississippi go from 50th in the nation for fourth grade reading up to 17th in the nation. And they were just one of just 10 states in this last 2024 national assessment, which saw their scores in fourth grade increase, while most other states saw their scores decrease over the past 2 years.
As you're describing, the approach of, well, I guess we'll bring the standards down so we can bring those numbers up. This is reminding me of a friend who had a car that was prone to problems. And so when the check engine light would come on, he had a Band-Aid he would stick over the check engine light. There, problem solved. And, if the engine was making weird noises, he would just turn up the radio. And it kind of reminds me of that in the sense that it's really not doing anything to fix the problem, but at least it's distracting from it so it's not as obvious. Tell me about with Mississippi seeing the results that they're seeing. Why aren't more states, why aren't all the states, for that matter, jumping on board this and taking a similar approach so that they actually address the problem rather than just mask it?
Definitely. So after Mississippi passed their legislation back in 2013, we've seen other states like Florida and Colorado also pass similar, very expansive evidence-based reading reforms for their early learners. And just since 2013, again, since Mississippi passed their reform, we've seen 40 states enact some sort of evidence-based method to teach students how to read. Now, not all of those have been comprehensive enough. So that's now where we're seeing that we should take lessons from Mississippi and invest in more comprehensive reforms. And that's something that we can do here in Illinois. Like you said, it's a band-aid right now if we just lower benchmarks, and this is not a band-aid that will last. It'll break off eventually because these are students, and like we mentioned, dropout rates increase. There's so many negative consequences to not handling the root of this issue and ensuring students are reading at these critical ages of third, fourth grade, and lower elementary.
Now, Hannah, you have some very specific suggestions that Illinois lawmakers and educators could take to see similar results to what Mississippi has seen. What are some of those steps?
Yeah, so there are really 5 steps which we've seen, and we gathered from research in Mississippi and other states which have enacted very comprehensive reforms, again, like I mentioned, such as Florida and Colorado. So some of those include ensuring school districts provide universal reading screenings to every lower elementary student to identify reading problems early. Just again, making sure that we know which students are struggling so that we can then go in and give them really targeted interventions, which is, again, another step that Illinois should pursue, which other states like Mississippi have done. Just finding which students are struggling and then giving them individualized reading interventions to make sure that they're meeting their grade level standards by the end of that school year, especially that third to fourth grade transition to mitigate those harms that we see happen for students who struggle to read. Some other reforms include engaging parents more in their child's reading deficiency, identification, and also the remediation of their child's struggles with reading. Again, parents, we see studies have shown that students do better when parents are more involved in their child's educations. This is a way to make sure parents are aware that their student is struggling in these early grades, and help engage them in however their child, whatever their child's specific intervention should be. And part of engaging parents also means collaborating with parents to determine where students should be placed at the end of a school year if they're still struggling to read. We've seen states like Mississippi enact legislation that requires students who are struggling to read at the end of third grade to be retained for another school year. But here in Illinois, we're advocating for that decision instead of a blanket decision because we recognize every student is different. Just engaging parents more in that decision when a child is reading at the end of the school year to empower parents to be decision makers alongside their teachers in schools to decide whether retaining their child is the best option, or pushing them along to the next school year with better supports and interventions. And ultimately, too, Illinois just needs to get down to basics for reading instruction and require science of reading instruction methods that really hammer down the basics of phonics and vocabulary, and all those just simple building blocks to language, make sure students are equipped and teachers know how to best help their students in these evidence-based teaching practices.
And I don't know if this is a question that you're prepared to answer, but I'm curious when such reforms as you're recommending are enacted, does it take some time? Is there some lag between when they start seeing better results, or is it something where they start to almost immediately see students improve?
There's definitely an implementation lag, like you mentioned, just as we get all school districts and teachers and administrators on board with this. And that's why it's so important to implement this on the state level. In Illinois, school districts could start right now by implementing these reforms within their own school districts. And they will see these, they will see these improvements among students, but enacting this statewide, there will be that delay that we might see in the outcomes, but ultimately it's an investment in these kids' futures and one that's worth taking in Illinois.
Once again, we are talking with Hannah Schmid. She is a contributor for Young Voices as well as a policy analyst for the Illinois Policy Institute. Hannah, where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, they can find me at illinoispolicy.org under Hannah Schmid and find all my articles. So please, we welcome your readership and we hope that you got on board with us to reform Illinois.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.